One of the things about Adam Peaty, I did an exercise on beliefs with him, self-belief. And he put as one of his self-beliefs, these conditions are perfect for me. And I asked him what he meant by that. And he said, well, we face all sorts of conditions. But if I have an attitude that these conditions are perfect for me, there's no excuse. 25-meter pool, 50-meter pool, indoor, outdoor, whatever. I just deal with it.
So I stumbled across this segment on Adam Peaty's Tokyo Olympics competition philosophy when I was about 3 months out from one of the biggest sporting challenges of my life. My team was one of the favourites to win the British University Sailing Championships. We had loads of talent, experience, speed, and we should have been able to go toe-to-toe with any of the other top players on the circuit. But we had a pretty big problem. Or more precisely, I was a bit of a problem. Every event we went to was an emotional roller coaster for me. I'd be anxious before we got in the boats, I'd be elated when we won races, and I'd be dejected when we lost. Underlying all of this was like this sense of frustration. There's like a lack of control. I felt like we ought to be winning races, and I had a strong sense in my mind of which teams we were better than and which sailors were faster or slower than me. Sailing is also a sport where the conditions have a uniquely large impact on the racing. A physical day of sailing in strong wind is very different to a tactical and delicate day of light wind sailing, and I knew which conditions were my perfect conditions. I also knew which conditions my opponents excelled in, and I knew this because, despite my recent lacklustre results, I was actually pretty good at my sport, and I could identify talent and mistakes in both myself and in others. Which led me to the question, when I heard the segment, of how someone like Adam Peaty, the best breaststroke swimmer of all time, could have the self-belief that all conditions were perfect for him. This wasn't like a mantra or an affirmation, but Weswick was genuinely calling this a self-belief, something he actually thought was true. So my first reaction was that this couldn't be true, and was therefore a form of self-delusion. There must be a pool temperature or length or format that contained a genuine competitive advantage for Adam. So labelling all conditions as perfect conditions was simply this kind of useful lie. It was also a logical falsehood to me. It couldn't be true that two differing sets of conditions could both at once be optimum conditions. But given my lack of options and my recent poor results, I figured I'd give the strategy of delusion a try. So as someone who prides themselves on their logical, science-based training and analytical approach to sport, lying to myself pretty much went against all of my sporting intuitions. But I'm certainly not someone to discredit a strategy without trying it, and so I began to turn up to events, trying to convince myself of every possible reason why I was perfectly suited to win that competition. And I quickly realised two things. So first of all, self-delusion is pretty tough, especially when you're stubborn and logical and think things through. The doubts just creep in, and that cynical voice in the back of your head can always produce counter-arguments to every story you feed it. It's pretty much a never-ending battle to try and keep a positive face on, and it was pretty exhausting, which isn't great for performance. But secondly, my experiment made me realise something that changed my attitude to sport completely. Maybe these really were my perfect conditions. So, if you were told that you had to prepare for a sporting competition taking place in a year's time, what would a perfect training plan look like? Would it look the same if the competition were in 3 months, or in a week, or in a day? What about in a minute's time? The word perfect can be defined both as an adjective, meaning the ideal, faultless form of something, but to perfect something can also be a verb. It can be an active pursuit, an expression of our labour, and to perfect something is to bring it to completion, to finish something, over whatever time period you have available. So by the time you step foot on the starting line, your training is complete, by definition. Whether you trained for a year, or a week, or a second, there's now nothing else you can do to prepare for this event. So for me, when I think about these being my perfect conditions, what I'm really saying is that the result of this race, or match, or event has already been decided. The result will be a sum of our previous experience and our previous training and what we ate for breakfast or had for dinner, and we now cannot affect the result of the contest. No use making excuses, it's already over. And there's a name for this kind of thinking, or this kind of philosophy. That's determinism. Determinism is a belief that all events in the universe are causally inevitable, including all of our human decisions. It's often contrasted with free will, which is a belief that we have control over our decisions as individuals, and both are philosophical positions with vast histories, nuances, and arguments for and against. But anyone can understand that generally the way we experience life is though both philosophies are partly true. We have some control over our decisions, but also sometimes our decisions are dictated by our circumstances and our nature and how we've grown up. And it's worth noting that we've got no ability to prove or disprove the determinist nature of the universe at this stage. It's not something which science is capable of. But anyway, in our lives, we feel as though we have a capacity to make decisions, as well as feeling as though those decisions are influenced by past events. And through our mindset, our logic, we're sometimes able to nudge our thinking one way or the other. The way, in my experience, that this shows up most commonly in sport is the idea of taking responsibility. We're always told through social media and other platforms and coaches to take responsibility for our actions, for our training. So rather than blaming our decisions on past events, we're told to take control of them ourselves. And this gives us this feeling of agency, of power, of control. It's essentially a rejection of determinism. And it's the way I always thought was better to act as an athlete. So agency and responsibility allow us to show up to training on time, to work hard, encourage us to learn from our mistakes. And these are definitely useful tools for becoming a better athlete, and they're meant to form part of a mindset that prevents us from making excuses. But this feeling of radical responsibility can become counterproductive once your training has ended and you're on the start line, because you don't have any control over all the conditions or actions in an event. You can't change the weather, or how much training you've already done, or whether you had the right breakfast. And taking responsibility for all the conditions of race day can only serve to induce unnecessary anxiety or feelings of overconfidence or feelings of despair. So just like in my sailing events, you'll feel out of control. The free will athlete understands that whatever conditions there are, those aren't their perfect conditions. They could always be better. They lament their past injuries or an imperfect training block, and their inability to let things be prevents them from getting into a flow state and performing to the best of their ability. Meanwhile, the athlete that takes a determinist view can see all of this through a completely different lens. The determinist athlete understands there's never any other way that this race could go. Their primary emotions are excitement and joy at the prospect of experiencing competing, rather than dread and fear of making mistakes. The pressure is taken off the competition and placed entirely on their training. And even if their training hasn't gone well, they know that there's now nothing they can do about it, and frustration is futile because it couldn't have gone any other way. They truly have that self-belief that these are their perfect conditions because there's no other way for them to have arrived on the start line, and therefore no better opportunity to discover what they're capable of at that moment. So like an artist, competition is no longer a measure of self, but instead it's an expression of self. So we all know those athletes who on race day, when it goes badly, they always just claim that they just had a bad day. And we often look at this as an example of athletes being unwilling to take responsibility for their own failure to perform in a competition. But I would argue that we should kind of start to view this instead as a failure of training rather than a failure of performance. The entire goal of training is to enable effective performance. So if the performance goes wrong, then certainly our training has also failed. We can debate about whether the performance has failed, but certainly the training has failed. So we need to continuously strive for better training and better methods of preparing to compete, rather than focusing on whether athletes made good or bad decisions on game day. If you take a determinist view, then a bad decision or performance in a game should instead be viewed as a collective failing of the athlete, team and coach to adequately prepare the athlete to make that decision in the game. And this really helped me to reframe my failings as an athlete. I could no longer just take responsibility for a bad day at an event. I couldn't performatively berate myself in front of my team. Instead, I had to take responsibility for my training and work to improve the systems which would allow me to show up for them and myself at the start line. And it also really made me fall in love with my sport again, because events became enjoyable and training was hard, but still fulfilling. So when training is the hardest part of your sport, then when you turn up on the start line, you're so much more prepared to leave it all out there. And when you arrive at an event, knowing there's no longer any time to change the result of the contest ahead of you, you relinquish control instead of trying to grasp at that out of control, and you can learn to be content with your result no matter what. So when you leave your doubts and what ifs behind, you arrive ready to actually give everything. You've accepted your fate, you're ready to work and suffer through adversity or whatever presents itself with no other option but through the obstacles before you. So in April 2022, after 3 days of tight racing, my team reached the finals of the British University Sailing Championships. It was a culmination of 14 years of sailing for me and the most important sporting event of my life at that time. The format was best of 5 races between the final 2 teams, and our teams traded races until we entered the 5th race and final race tied up at 2-2, and we lost that last race by about 2 metres. But it was also the best I ever raced in my life. I had plenty of areas I was excited to get to work on in our next training session for sure, but the lack of control I felt about my racing was no longer holding me back. Instead, it was setting me free. Oh, and Adam Peaty won gold in the 100-metre breaststroke in Tokyo in the 5th fastest time in history. So I guess those conditions really were perfect for him. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and don't forget to like and subscribe.